interest stemmed, first of all, from basically two things. First of all, I'm a child of survivors. You know, my father, my parents were German Jews, and my father was arrested by the Gestapo. He hid out in the basement. This is one of the regrets I have. I only heard parts of the story because at that point, when I was young, I was not very curious. Maybe I had Holocaust fatigue as well. And I wasn't very curious to hear all the details. I think that was also because of my mother, because my mother never wanted to talk about the Holocaust. My father was very open about it. And maybe I should have asked, I'm afraid, you know, he's dead now, but I wished I would have asked. I only heard parts of the story. But he was arrested. Obviously, he was on the run. He was put in Dachau, got out of Dachau on a false visa. That's a whole other story that I don't know all the details about. But I think that the fact that, and he finally escaped, but he spent time in Dachau. He went to England, and then in England, a lot of people don't know about this, but a lot of the German Jews were persecuted in England because if you spoke with a German accent during the war, you were suspect. Even though you were a Jew and you were living in England fleeing the Nazis, if you were German, you went before a tribunal. My father went before a tribunal, and he was exiled and sent to the Isle of Man. And then from the Isle of Man, he was exiled to Ontario, Canada, where he spent 10 months in Ontario, okay? So that's my father's story. Finally, he got back to England and then met my mother. I asked my mother once, because she didn't want to speak much about the Holocaust, and she lost her parents and she lost her sister. They perished during the Shoah. My uncle got here on the Kindertransport, not to England, the one that went to America, which very few people know about. So I have a very interesting family background. But my mother told me, I always asked her, how come you were never imprisoned and put on the Isle of Man with the rest of the people, the German Jews that they were suspected of being a third column? And she said, I acted like I was mentally retarded. I acted like I was an idiot. They don't want to have nothing to do with me. I thought it was a very interesting story. So I have a very interesting background. And I think also that two other things. I think that a lot of my personality, unfortunately, you hear these stories all the time about the children of survivors. And even though my mother was not put in a camp, she escaped in June of '39. She got out. She got out to England because she got papers that this Jewish family in England would take her in as a kind of a governess of the children. That's how she got out of Germany. But she got out very late. But she suffered tremendously, tremendous psychological damage because her parents were killed, her sister was killed. I think, like a lot of children survivors, a lot of the psychological damage was transmitted. And I think that growing up as a child, being a child of survivors had a deep effect on my formation of my personality. So I was aware of all of this, you know, especially when I was developing. So I had a deep interest from a psychological point of view, for my passion of history, for the fact that I'm a Jew, that deeply interested about the survival of my people, and finally, which I think was the strongest influence on me, my deep interest in German history. Now, what's interesting is that up until maybe about 10 years ago, my interest in German history was primarily before the Hitler period. I did my doctoral dissertation on the Weimar Republic, an aspect of the Weimar Republic, which are the years right after World War I up until Hitler. And yes, I learned about Hitler, I learned about the Nazi period, but I always shied away from getting scholarly interested from a scholar's point of view. I always loved studying about pre-Hitler Germany. So I always had a great love of German history and German culture. So there's that interest, that background interest in there also. So all these influences came together. That leads me back to the whole question of I wished I would have asked my father more questions. I wished I would have been, when I was younger, more curious about my father's background. I knew about my mother's background even less so because she was less willing to talk. My father was quite assimilated. He would have gone back to Germany. They invite all the Jews back to Germany. You know, the German government pays for your airfare and your visit to the city where you were born and grew up. My father got such a invitation when I was a child, and he was sick at the time. He couldn't do it. I made that trip later on when I returned to his hometown, being his son, and I made that trip. I mean, they didn't pay for it at the time, but I wanted to learn more about it. Actually, that's another story. My paternal grandparents, they died before the Holocaust. So their graves were in Krefeld, where my father and my grandparents lived. And nobody had been, as far as I know, to their graves since my father had been there in Germany, just before he was arrested by the Gestapo. So one of the first things I wanted to do is go to my grandparents' graves and say Kaddish for them. So that was a very interesting experience as well. That was a personal journey. It was a trying to reconcile myself. And to put it in brief, as much as I had this tremendous love of German culture, which was, I think, ingrained in me by my father, it was very interesting, because my father was the one who was physically persecuted. My mother was not physically persecuted. My father was the one who was put in Dachau. My father was the one who was, later on the exile story. And yet he loved German culture. Grew up with Beethoven, even Wagner, opera, German literature, everything. There was no shying away. So I think my father really, I got nurtured by my father. So I had this passion of German history and German culture. When I went to Germany, I began to experience, really for the first time, some real negative feelings about Germany, which really shocked me, okay? So I was very concerned about that, of why a person who is a German historian, who is devoted much of his adult life to studying German history and culture and has such a passion, why should that person be all of a sudden have these terrible feelings about German people? And I just felt bad at times about it just all came back to me. And the whole Holocaust story all came back to me. And at one point, looking at all these people, and anybody at that time, it was a number of years ago, anybody over 65, 70 years old, I looked at, and the first question I had in my mind, what were they doing during the war? What about their children? Or how do their children feel about Jews? How do they feel about their country now? And I became almost obsessed with negative feelings about Germany. So it was a personal journey. And how this all came about was when I had all these negative feelings about Germans and German people, I wanted to really straighten this out in my mind of how I felt that way. Well, I went to Dachau. I had to go to Dachau where my father was, and my wife and I went, and we had absolutely no emotions. Our emotions were absolutely cold. I could not emote then. That night I went home and I was really upset. I said I didn't feel where my father was, where our people were. I just couldn't feel anything. And I felt really terrible about that. Well, I'm leaving out a lot to make it brief, but I remember going to Checkpoint Charlie. And that was the turning point. And Checkpoint Charlie is, that's where they crossed over into, when it was divided, Berlin was crossed over. They have a museum that's dedicated to, the Berlin Wall and the persecution of the German people under communism. And I remember going through the exhibit. It was a great exhibit, and I remember the documentary that they were showing, and it was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, the Berlin Wall fell in '89. In November of '89, this was, I believe, 1996. It was my first trip, actually my first trip to Germany, in Berlin. And they started playing, Leonard Bernstein playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the great choral movement, and pictures of the Berlin Wall falling. And I started crying. So I said, why am I crying? And I started feeling, really very emotional. And I realized, well, these were people too. These people these people were being persecuted under communism from 1945 to 1989, and communism was had fallen already. So I felt great joy and happiness, but great emotion too. And now I felt even worse, because I felt I couldn't cry at Dachau, but I could cry at these great pictures of the fall of the Berlin Wall for other people's liberation. And I felt terrible, and I began to think this all through. And that's how the whole idea of reconciliation, that I have to reconcile myself, to all these mixed emotions. And so it was kind of a personal journey. And I have to say that even I go to Germany about 4 times a year to talk about the Holocaust and talk about this whole problem of reconciliation. And I have to say that, I still am not 100%. As much as I love Germany and I love the German people, I'm not 100% rid of all of this. And it troubled me. I wanted to be completely free of any anti-German feeling. And I finally made peace with myself, and I said, as a Jew, as a person who's gone through my history and everything, I probably will never feel 100% free of what I've experienced. And I felt better. And I stopped feeling bad about this, and I just didn't have any negative feelings anymore. And then just last June, when I was in Germany again, this is, I think, a very interesting story. I was having a beer in Berlin with my wife outside a restaurant, right on Potsdamer Platz. And I went in to go to the restroom, and I looked at the waitress, and I said to the waitress, I said, in German, "Can we have our bill, please?" And she said, "Jawohl." Suddenly, my body cringed. Now, jawohl is something that I hadn't heard for a while. I'm sure German people still say jawohl, but jawohl is something you see in Hollywood with the depiction of the Nazi soldiers. When they stood to attention, they said, "Jawohl." And suddenly, I had this terrible reaction. Well, I didn't make anything of it. I went back to my wife. I said, "You know what? I thought I was rid of this. I'm still feeling this." And I just accepted it. That's it. I just accept it. But I talk about this very openly with the German kids. And that's my way of communicating reconciliation. Because when they see somebody who is open about discussing these things, they're beginning to open up too.
So is that what goes on?
Yeah. Now, I talk a lot about my own personal journey. Even in Berlin, any of the major cities, you would think that, most of the kids are more sophisticated, the education might be a little bit better than in the provinces, and they know a little bit more about Jewish history and the Holocaust. And I talk about Judaism, and I talk about the Jews, and they don't know anything. And I'm talking about in some of the best gymnasiums in Berlin, they know a little bit about it. But here is this New York Jew coming to them and talking to them about his feelings and about the Holocaust, about Jewish history. And they're really amazed at what they're hearing, because they've never heard this. They tell me, they still tell me, and this is not in a negative way, they tell me that when I say, "Well, what do you think of when you think of a Jew?" I ask them very openly, this first thing I talk about. So, "Well, we think of the person, with those long curls and the black hat." And I said, "Stop." I said, "Yes, that's true of a segment of the Jewish community." And I talked to them about the diversity of the community. I even talk about the diversity within the Orthodox community and go through the various aspects of Orthodox Judaism. So this is a whole education for them. But I do it hopefully in a non-threatening, non-fatiguing way that they're very open to this, because I get very personal about it.